Our focus today is international perspectives on regulation and evaluating digital health, with a challenging question for our three guests. Can we move beyond regulation, stifling innovation? Very briefly, and before we start today, a little by way of background and how the session will be run today. Firstly, I'd like to thank all the collaborators who have made this series possible. Today's brought to you by DigitalHealth.London, MedCity and the Health Innovation Network in collaboration with University College London. The university has provided a grant to support knowledge exchange, and that's what's enabled us to be here today. So by way of background, the reason a group of us started this project is because we wanted to bring together different communities in digital health with a focus on moving forward discussions and debate about the kinds of evidence needed to improve digital health and ensure products are safe, effective, and meet the needs of patients and professionals in health and social care systems. So this is our first webinar in a series. We have more information on upcoming webinars at the end. And we're just really hoping that you will send in lots of questions today and engage in the discussion. And we very much see this as the beginning of a broader discussion on evidence generation in digital health. So who do we have today? Three experts from the USA, Germany, and the UK. We're going to invite you to engage in discussion and send your questions and comments via the chat. And Henry Potts will be monitoring this throughout the webinar, and he will present questions to the panel of experts at the end. You can also contribute to the discussion via Twitter using the handle EvaluateDigiHealth. So now to our speakers and to get into discussion. We are very grateful to have here Jennifer Goldsack, Executive Director of the Digital Medicine Society in the USA, Dr. Sven Jungmann, Chief Medical Officer of Founders Lane, Germany, and Neelam Patel, CEO of MedCity. So I'm going to go to the speakers in turn and ask them to tell us and our audience a bit about your current work and your organization, and just a little bit on your interest in evidence generation for digital health. Sven, welcome from Germany. Maybe you could begin today.
Yes, with pleasure. Thank you for having me, and thank you everybody for being here. Very much looking forward to the conversations. I'm Sven. I'm a medical doctor by training, left clinical care to now build digital technologies in the healthcare space. And we do that together with established corporations. So for example, with an insurance company from Germany, we are creating a new app that helps patients with hip or knee osteoarthritis find the right treatment and the right care path for themselves. And the interest in evidence, I guess, is quite clear. We don't want any more intuitively charming tools that end up being the digital version of snake oil. We want tools that really have proven value, and that's also increasingly demanded by regulators and by the medical community.
Brilliant, thanks very much. And how long have you been working in this space and this rapidly evolving field, Sven?
I think it's been 3 or 4 years now.
Okay, great, really welcome today. Jennifer, are you there from the USA? Thank you for joining us today.
I am. I'm dialing in from Sarasota, Florida this morning, which is home for me and now my home office, although I don't sound like I'm particularly Floridian. So definitely providing the curveball for this morning's conversation. So Jean, as you said, I'm the Executive Director for the Digital Medicine Society, or DIME. We are the professional society for experts from all disciplines contributing to advancing the safe, effective, ethical, and equitable use of digital medicine to optimize health. You asked a really great question about why we're interested in evidence. Our name, the Digital Medicine Society, is not by accident. It was very intentional not to be the Digital Health Society. Digital health is critically important. We would define digital medicine as those evidence-based digital products used in the service of health. And so for us, evidence is absolutely critical. And when we think about where the difference is going to be made in this digital era of health, we really think that actually evidence is going to be the driver for all of that. And I go back to our mission, which is safe, effective, ethical, and equitable. I think if we don't have evidence to support those claims, we could find ourselves deploying these technologies, deploying these tools, and potentially doing things like increasing health disparities rather than narrowing them using digital tools, reducing efficiencies instead of improving them. And so for us, it always comes back to evidence. And so I'm delighted to be part of this conversation today.
That's great, Jen. And just very quickly, the Digital Medicine Society, you're a collaborative organisation as well. Maybe you could say a little bit more about the kind of organisations you would pair up with over in the USA.
Yeah, of course. So our member unit is the individual, and we take that really seriously, trying to support all of the different experts, from sort of white hat hackers all the way through to sort of government experts and every flavor of sort of clinical and tech expert in between. But we also recognize that, you know, changing the course of healthcare, such an enormous and complicated industry, we would be naive to think that we could impact that alone. So over here in the US, we have a partnership with the American Telemedicine Association. Currently, we're working with colleagues at the World Economic Forum on a project using sort of commercial technologies in managing epidemics. We work an awful lot with organizations like the Digital Therapeutics Alliance. We have a partnership with our colleagues at the Biohacking Village at DEF CON. We really take security seriously. If you're connected to the internet, you can be hacked. So let's be eyes wide open about that. For us, the purpose of the Digital Medicine Society is to show Big Tent thinking, to recognize that in the absence of having a bioethicist at the table with your security researcher, with patient experts, citizen scientists, regulators, payers, clinical experts, researchers, tech folks, data scientists, the list goes on, we're going to have a blind spot. And so we, to us, this new field should be built upon a foundation of collaboration across disciplines, and not with our vendor colleagues, for example, at arm's length, but true sort of collaboration, speaking a unifying language and having sort of shared values about what we're trying to do here. And that extends not just at the sort of disciplinary level, but also to the organizational level. And so, Jean, I'm really delighted you asked about collaboration, and obviously delighted to be part of the sort of collaborative efforts with you across the pond. And it feels silly to say that from this side, but yes.
That's great. Thank you. So yeah, we're a collaboration, and I think a lot of people in this field would say that bringing together different disciplines in digital health is really important. So another organisation we have is represented here is MedCity, and we have Neelam Patel, who's CEO of MedCity. Neelam, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your work and interest and what your organisation is doing in this space?
Yep, absolutely, Jean, and really excited to be here with colleagues from Germany and the US, and brilliant work on the team to get us all together, actually. So yes, I'm the Chief Exec of MedCity. MedCity is an organisation that was developed to grow the health and life science sector within London and the South East. We work incredibly closely with many partners that support businesses to help navigate the landscape to research, develop, manufacture and commercialize their innovations for the benefit of patients and the community. And your question around our interests in terms of evidence, well, that stems back really from MedCity being one of the founding members with the Health Innovation Network and other AHSNs in DigitalHealth.London, really focused on supporting digital innovators to help develop their innovations to enable access by the NHS, the health and social care system. One of the things that we very early on found was that innovators found it really difficult to understand how to evidence their technologies. Well, in fact, many of them didn't even realize actually at the time that the evidence was necessary and what that evidence needed to look like. So that was from the innovator point of view. And then from the health and social care point of view, clarity was really needed to understand what good looked like. You know, what does a good innovation look like? How safe and effective does it need to be? And all of those important questions to make sure that quality innovations reach patients to get the benefit that is needed. And so MedCity, along with DigitalHealth.London, started a program of work really to try and help define what these benchmarks needed to look like. And we were very fortunate then to partner with NICE and NHS England and others to start to co-develop actually standards with innovators themselves. And so that started our journey in trying to simplify the landscape, translate the needs of the health and care system so that innovators really knew early on what the benchmarks needed to be.
Thank you very much. So this is all really useful background, and now I'm going to throw some really, really hard questions out. So we're not going to be able to solve this, but if you just do a little bit of reading around regulation, even if I'm in the UK context, for example, suddenly we have the Care Quality Commission, we have the MHRA, we have NICE standards. There's a lot of standards, and each countries are producing their own guidance. So we wanted to bring together people from different parts of the health system, from Germany, from the US, and hear your perspectives on what's happening with evidence standards in digital health in your countries. So obviously COVID's delayed certain decisions, and it's changed certain regulatory standards with regards to some innovations coming through at the moment. Could you each tell me a bit about what you're seeing at the moment, and do you think we're making progress regarding standards for digital health? Jen, if I could loop back with you to start this, what's the development in the USA at the moment?
Yeah, so I think we absolutely are making progress. I'm going to be the language police for a second, because I think it's not because I think sort of nitpicking the words we choose is in and of itself a valuable exercise, but I think that when we talk about different digital products, one of the things that's inhibited the progress in the field to date is using very broad brushstrokes to talk about very different digital products. And I think it's useful for us to think about the claims these different products are making and the different contexts of use, and let that guide us towards what the evidence demand should be. What I'm really excited about is that we're seeing that sort of more thoughtful approach increasingly over here in the sort of the regulations and the demands for evidence in the US. And I think that's going to help us. So for example, things like what the FDA, for example, would define as a general wellness product. So a sort of a low risk technology that is specifically not regulated as a medical device. Something like a clinical decision support tool that does nothing more than synthesize and display information for clinical decision making that the clinician could simply find themselves. It's just helping them organize information. Things like record keeping systems, EHRs, things like communication technologies, even like Zoom that we're on today, have been deployed, particularly over the last 6 months in healthcare, right? I would put these into the digital health bucket, where obviously we want them to be secure systems, we want them to have some quality, but they don't need the rigorous clinical evidence that I think we would expect for other products. Then when we want to start sort of measuring and or intervening in health, when we want to have decision support tools that are autonomously making decisions based on data that they've collected, when we're thinking about sensor technologies that infer a health status, all of these sorts of things, sort of what we would describe as digital medicine, increasingly we need sort of evidence for those. And then at the highest level, I think the digital therapeutic products, where the software itself, not software plus a molecule, but the software itself is the intervention, I think requires the highest level of evidence, just as you would expect for a new molecule coming to the market. I think we're doing particularly well with the digital therapeutic space. I think we're really achieving clarity about what a digital therapeutic is and the evidence required. And we can see that borne out. Achille had a digital therapeutic approved just this spring. On the sort of general wellness side, unfortunately, I think there's probably still a lot of digital snake oil out there. It's very much a sort of caveat emptor sort of market, buyer beware. There's 300 and something health apps. I'm not sure that many are terribly good, but what I do think it provides is an opportunity to sort of deploy low risk tools and learn from them as we go. So I think, and we'll get to regulation later, I think there's actually an opportunity in specific carve outs for wellness products to help us learn more quickly. I think the sort of the measurement products, the algorithms that are driving care decisions are perhaps the area where we have the least clarity around what evidence is required and how you demonstrate, for example, the absence of bias in a decision algorithm, how you think about the different levels of evidence needed for a digital measurement product, whether you want to have it available as a product going through the Center for Devices, or whether you want to use it, for example, in clinical research to evaluate an endpoint. There's still, I don't think, clarity around what that evidence should look like. We've done a lot of that work at the Digital Medicine Society trying to fill that gap, but I think that's where the focus, certainly in the US, needs to continue to be. And I'm really curious to hear from my colleagues how that jives with what we're seeing across different regulatory regions in Europe.
So Sven, that's really interesting. We've got this interesting boundary between wellness and digital therapeutics or digital medicine and high risk digital health products. But Germany's done something very interesting with its Digital Care Act this year. So maybe, and the idea of having apps on prescription, which changes some of the evidence standards that are going to be required by insurers. So could you give us an update on that and the implications in Germany?
Yeah, of course. So these last years, I always got annoyed quite regularly because I was trying to hold up the evidence flag whenever I was working with startups and investors and so on. And often it seemed to me that evidence was seen as a new kind of marketing gig. But then they always said, yeah, let's do a little study, but let's make sure that we analyze the data and sort of we decide what goes out and so on. And I thought, well, that's not really how this works. I'm sorry. And that often ended up in serious conflict with some people. And then suddenly in later last year with our new health minister, who's done a lot to drive digital innovation in healthcare because it's long overdue. Germany has been a massive laggard to a point where I felt it was quite embarrassing. And they, as you said, brought up this Digital Care Act. And it affects something that we in Germany call DiGA, which is Digitale Gesundheitsanwendung, and that stands for Digital Health Application. They have a very clear definition, which again is a little bit different from what's used abroad. In this sense, they mean anything that first and foremost creates value for patients. So it doesn't matter if doctors or nurses benefit from it, but it's only focused on improving care from the patient point of view. And what they mean by improvement can be two things. It can be either that it actually affects medical outcomes, such as quality of life measures or mortality, morbidity, etc. Or it could be what is a beautiful, very long German word for it that goes down like honey running down your throat. I'm not going to say it, but it basically translates into patient-relevant structural or procedural improvements.
I think you have to say that in German now.
Patientenrelevante Struktur- und Verfahrensverbesserungen.
I'm glad I didn't attempt that. So this is interesting from the patient angle, though, and seems like there's more of a focus on the patient perspective and outcomes. Would you say in the new German system?
Yeah, entirely. And even sort of the second bracket, which is not medical outcomes, could be time savings to patients or a better adherence to guidelines or sort of a sense of empowerment or whatever you call it. And in this initial draft that was proposed by the Ministry of Health, they also said, so this is something that you need to provide some of these benefits, at least one of them. And you need to be a medical device that is at least class 1 or class 2A, I believe. They left out the higher risk ones for the beginning because they thought we need to learn first what's going to happen, which I think makes sense. And then they said the third requirement is that you bring evidence. And in this initial draft that came from the government, they said, and by evidence, we mean anything from, well, a case report, could be an expert opinion, could be a study or something like that. We don't want to be overzealous here because the value of the data that's been won, and et cetera, will far outweigh everything else. So the classical arguments of digital exceptionalism, and fortunately that created quite some outcry within the industry and within academics and the medical community, because they said, well, sorry, but this is not what you should, I mean, this is not evidence, right? You can get a case report anywhere. And then a couple of months later, they drafted a very clear guideline with a lot of information on what they actually expect, and they were raising the bar significantly. And that's thanks to something I'm really impressed with that too. They set up what they call a health innovation hub. So they created an entirely new entity that reports directly to the Minister of Health, with a lot of different experts, from lawyers, people who worked in startups, doctors, and so on. And they ended up creating this together with the community. So the regular webinars, you can hand in questions and ideas and so on. It's very personal in the way they engage with the developer community and the medical community in a wider sense. And I think we're quite living to this principle of lean, agile government. The new standards require you to do a comparative study. It can be retrospective if that's feasible at all, but in most cases it's not. So it will be prospective. You have to get proper ethics committee approval. You have to get approval from the National Authority for Medical Devices with a lot of clear criteria. And now, I mean, we're still trying to find the right balance. Now, a lot of people say, well, now you're being too strict. And what's really happening is that the insurance companies, who have no interest in paying too much for this, are trying to find arguments for why they should be paying less, and they will sort of hit you hard on the type of evidence you created. At the same time, a lot of people don't really know how to get good evidence for the devices, because your typical randomized control trials don't work quite as well. What are you going to do? Is it going to be a placebo app? Are people just going to use standard of care? Many of these apps, even if they're only focused on patients, at the same time will affect processes on the provider side. So we've built something that sends people questionnaires on, do you have a risk of falling? Do you have a risk of getting multi-resistant germs while you're in the hospital? And it displays that to the doctors. And we already see that in some places doctors previously didn't ask that, but now they get that every time. So even if they then later on see a patient who doesn't use our app, they might still be triggered to ask it, because it becomes the new standard procedure. And there are a ton of examples. I'm happy to talk more about it, but I'm sure we all have some thoughts on this, where this just becomes quite complicated, and there is not enough knowledge in the country to really deal with that properly. And we don't also know exactly what will be accepted, how much you can charge, and how the pricing will happen, and so on. I'm going to an event later on for this with all of the entrepreneurs from Berlin, where we just try to make sense of what's going on.
So an evolving space very much, and also because of the reimbursement complexities, it's really helpful also to be thinking about research designs and what's being asked of digital health companies. And certainly within this webinar series and in our academic webinar, we're going to touch on some of that. And in terms of the how to evaluate digital health products. Neelam, at home here in London, you've heard now the views of Jen and Sven. You've been very involved in the NICE evidence standards, I understand. So what do you think in terms of, are we making progress over here? And what do you think the direction of travel is? Is it something very different from Germany and the US, or do these themes sound familiar?
Yes, thanks, Jean. I think actually there is a lot of similarity with both Sven and Jen's summary of where we are in the UK. So there's absolute progress. I would say it is still evolving, and it's a fast-moving field in terms of just technology development. In terms of the standards, I think where we sit is that companies need actually a reason to provide or to demonstrate evidence and to generate evidence. And very often, in fact, many times, it is really important to consider the pathway as a whole. And so, some of the focus I think is important to reinforce is that in terms of where the UK is development of that pathway that's hugely important, which also helps feed into learning about what the right evidence is for certain types of technologies. So, for example, NICE has been integrally involved in defining evidence standards, like you say, Jean, and working with partners in doing so. They're also developing what is called Health Tech Connect, which is a portal inviting digital innovators and device innovators to actually log on and register with the portal to give NICE and other evaluators and support agencies early sight as to the types of technology that they're developing and the types of evidence that they're generating, so that there is early interaction with agencies and developers, which is really important, I think, to innovators, so that they actually go about understanding the needs and therefore defining their research early. And the evidence standards really form a part of that blueprint for that. So as Jen mentioned earlier, there's a real importance in terms of proportionality. So not all technologies need the gold standard of the randomized controlled trial, for example, nor would all innovators absolutely have the time or money to spend in RCTs. And so the evidence standards are really well designed to address that proportionality, and largely based on risk to patients. So the more integrally involved that technology is in terms of decision making for patient care, the higher the burden for that technology in terms of demonstrating that evidence. And absolutely right, Sven. That sort of sorts out when evidence is being used for a marketing claim versus true evidence to show effectiveness and cost value. So the standards do support innovators as well as commissioners think about evidence for effectiveness and use of user experience at the outset, involvement of patients at the outset, recognition for health inequalities and accessibility for technologies, as well as clinical effectiveness. And it also talks about value for money and cost effectiveness, which is hugely important when you go further down the line and convince a commissioner that the technology is actually going to generating a cost saving. So that's been hugely important to define those parameters. And then further down the pathway is also evaluation and support to evaluators and commissioners in understanding and translating that evidence into something that they may then use to evaluate that technology. And right down then to talk about reimbursement you know, people talk a lot about value-based care and how to actually measure the impact of that technology on a longer term to start to understand real-world evidence coming from that technology to then loop back into that system. So that is the direction of flow. Not all of the pieces are there in the way they need to be, certainly, but there are, you know, plenty of opportunities to start to learn from the commissioned technologies that are there to then further define standards and payment models.
I think, thank you. This is so interesting. It sounds like, and this is a bit of an open question to the panel, it might be too early to think of convergence happening because there are quite a few gaps still, and particularly around automation. And there's also different issues coming out. There's generating the evidence and why you do that. So the motivation around generating quality evidence, and also then how it's used and communicated and then informs decision-making, particularly around what we call commissioning here in the UK, or purchasing or reimbursement in other systems. I mean, do you think, although the countries have slightly different approaches, we're heading to a place, this is the big question for this webinar, are we moving to a place where we can move beyond the fear of regulation stifling innovation? So are we going to have a proportionate and pragmatic approach to evidence generation that meets the needs of these different stakeholders and users, or do you think we're at risk of evidence standards almost becoming a barrier? It's a tricky question. Who would like to tackle that one first?
I recently read that there are about 300,000 health apps available on the App Store, with about 200 added every day. So clearly regulation isn't stifling innovation. There's loads of it going on. I think for me, the question is, how can we make or how can we enable regulation and standards accessible and proportionate enough so that the innovation coming through is adding impact, and people just inherently know, innovators inherently know right from the outset what those benchmarks need to be. And I think that's the crux of it, really, for me. Very simple answer. So at the moment, I wouldn't say that it is stifling innovation at all. Whether or not it's quality innovation is yet to be seen.
Okay, over to Sven or Jen, who would like to respond?
I might jump in. So I think probably nobody in this virtual room here would disagree that evidence is important. And in fact, I don't think it's foreign to most software developers, even if they're in e-commerce and so on. They spend a considerable amount of time doing what they call A/B tests, which is the cheap version of a randomized control trial, to really understand, for example, where their marketing efforts should go and where they can get more bang for the buck. The problem is that I think if you do that in healthcare, you suddenly come into a field where it's much more rigorous, where it can't be done so fast, and where you often require sort of the right setting. You can't just do it online often. You need a clinical setting and so on, and that increases complexity a lot, and it also increases the needs you have on your team as a startup, for example. So you would need people with a medical background, with maybe clinical epidemiology backgrounds, or you name it. And that simply adds a lot of cost and a lot of additional risk to you as an early stage venturer, if you will. And at the same time, there is no patience for that in the investor community. They often don't understand it. I have friends who developed a really, really cool tool, which is extremely promising. And then they reached a point where somebody said to them, and rightfully so, you now need to do a clinical trial that is comparative. And they went for estimations, how many people would they need, and came up with around 500 people, which amounted to costs of several million British pounds. And they were hoping that the investors would understand that, but all these investors heard was, okay, you have a big risk, you want me to fund that. It's not going into product development or marketing or I don't know, any other way of creating new customers. Well, come back when you have it. And so now they're in this limbo where nobody wants to fund it because they don't have the evidence, and they can't get the evidence because nobody wants to fund the evidence. So I think I wouldn't say that requirements for evidence as such are stifling innovation. I think they can actually drive innovation if you do it properly, and if you, I mean, and evidence is not always you have to run a trial. Often it can be that you also need to do a systematic literature review to understand the needs of your users and so on in a very detailed manner, which is also something that's not new to startups. They do market research all the time. They just don't know how to do it with PubMed and so on. So one problem is the funding side. How can you get that funded? The other thing is the human resource side. How can you get enough people with these skills who at the same time understand how early stage ventures function? What I learned when I left clinical medicine was that there were a lot of new things I needed to learn, but what was more important were figuring out the things I need to unlearn to really be able to interface with this new community. And that's very problematic. I try to hire doctors all the time, and with most, I'm utterly frustrated because their mindset is just completely unadapted to what I need them for. And I think another big issue where it is indeed stifling is the way these regulations are being executed. A lot of the authorities are not sufficiently trained to understand how a digital therapeutic is different from, let's say, a drug or any other medical device. The doctors are overwhelmed with it. Especially because, as we heard earlier, there are so many of them, and then they get updated potentially on a weekly basis. So how do you know that something that was good 5 months ago still is now? And I think there's a lack of dependability at the moment. So you might want to start to do a clinical trial now, but you don't know who's going to accept it under these standards that you did it now. And I think that's a bit different where you have a lot of established best practices as you have in the pharmaceutical industry.
Thanks, Sven. So many important issues there, particularly the estimating the cost of generating evidence, particularly when you're at an early stage of development or looking for investment. Jen, before we go over to questions from those watching today, and I'll hand over to Henry, could you provide your view on that regulation stifling innovation query? What are your reflections?
Certainly in the US, I don't think that regulation is stifling innovation. I think, you know, Neela mentioned the 300,000 plus health apps. I'd mentioned maybe a little dismissively early that there's probably a lot of those that aren't terribly good, but they are low risk. And what that does allow us to do is leverage the more traditional learning health system approaches and some of the sort of quality improvement approaches we've taken before, deploying things like a low risk sleep tracker to see, for example, over here in the VA, which is the single sort of federal health system we use nationwide to take care of our warfighters after they return and retire from active service. You know, if we can deploy it there and we can see how using things like a sleep tracker might help us improve outcomes in mental health, the fact that, you know, those very basic over-the-counter sort of sleep tracker products that are classified as wellness technologies, that actually allows us to innovate really nicely, because there is this particular carve out for low-risk products to be classified as a wellness device, for example. The things that do make me nervous are, and I'm curious to hear what folks in the audience might think, as well as my fellow experts here on the panel. I do think that digital technologies are held to a higher standard right now than more traditional approaches. I sometimes feel my head exploding when I see people sort of dig into, you know, questions about, you know, simple algorithms for things as, you know, step count isn't a terribly good example, but let's use it here. And then I'm just, you know, I'm like, well, you know, so we think the 6-minute walk test is good. It's a horrendous, like, blunt instrument. And so I think sometimes I get frustrated when perhaps a lack of understanding about how these products work inhibit a sort of warm embrace where they can be very low risk and potentially really high impact. I also think that we might be focusing on the wrong things in some instances. If we talk to our hardware engineering colleagues, they can tell us very easily, using sort of gold standard reference standards at the bench, whether a sensor performs well or not. That is not a hard question to answer, and we shouldn't be falling over ourselves because we don't understand it. We need to trust our engineering colleagues and their documentation and move on. And I think the same thing with algorithms as well. A lot of us might not understand them to the extent that we understand testing that happens in a wet lab, for example, but understanding the evidence we need to look for to understand how the data was captured, make sure there's no inherent bias, and how it was tested, that should be enough to satisfy us. Where I think we aren't focusing enough, and it's a particularly pressing issue here in the States because we have woefully inadequate privacy regulations, are, you know, now if we're starting to use sort of commercial technologies or even medical devices, right? Where is the data flowing? How secure is it? Who else has access to this? And also I think health data takes on a very different form in the digital era. Some researchers at Microsoft, I think 2 years ago, were able to diagnose with 99% specificity early stage pancreatic cancer, based on nothing other than folks' Google searches. So if we imagine that that information is used for early outreach and better decision-making to identify and treat those individuals, that's great. In the US, you can also sell that information if you're a data aggregator to a life insurance company and make sure that person can't get life insurance or they can't get a mortgage. So I think we have to think about, what does safety mean in the digital era when we have these different data flows, all of which can be sort of aggregated together? What can we infer about a person's health status, and how do we define risk a little bit differently? I think that we're using old frameworks, and I don't think they're going to serve us terribly well. And then the last thing I'd say on that, when I sort of want to emphasize that we need to think about these evaluation frameworks a little bit differently than we have historically, is I think we focus too much on the individual tools or digital products in isolation, whether it's a single algorithm, whether it's a single sort of sensor technology, whether it's a therapeutic. there's appropriately a big focus on thinking about how we embed these products into a traditional clinical workflow. I'm fully supportive of that because the clinical experts, whether it's nurses, whether it's physicians, they do far too much administrative work already, and I'm not willing to see our industry pile on. At the same time, I don't necessarily want us to maintain the existing clinical workflows. I think we've proven that they're suboptimal. And so I also think we need to think not about each and every individual tool in isolation. Otherwise, we're going to have this horrible patchwork, these sort of layers of the onion that just make things more complicated. I think we also have to think at an ecosystem level. And how do we evaluate not just the safety and efficacy and sort of equitability of a single product, but how do we think about how that fits into a new era of healthcare where, as Sven said, we do a lot more sort of health promotion, and we do a lot more to empower patients with data, that we take a lot of the care out of the clinic, the research out of the clinic. We meet patients where they are, we give them what they need. We organize our thinking about healthcare differently to give the patients a better experience, to improve outcomes, and hopefully to reduce cost along the way too. So evidence is important, but I also want to push us to think about evidence and the evolution of evidence as rapidly as sort of the field is innovating.
Thanks, Jen. Thank you so much. So I'm now going to hand over to Henry, because we've had so many points raised. We can't possibly attend to all of them today, but I can see in my field of vision that the chat has been very, very active. We've heard various things about, you may agree or disagree with them today, from digital snake oil to the boundary between kind of wellness and higher risk applications, and gradually taking a more systems view on how these digital health tools are transforming healthcare and pathways. Henry, hello, welcome. What's been said online?
Hello world. As Jean said, we're not going to have time for all of your questions, but we will review all of those and look at how we can tackle some of them in later webinars. More webinars are planned. But let's start. One question that has come in that took my interest was, is evidence transferable? Do we know whether companies can take the evidence they've generated in one country and go to another country and satisfy the necessary regulatory processes, or indeed satisfy what commissioners want? Or do we see companies having to start from scratch? Does anyone have any experiences they can share?
I can kick off, Henry, if you'd like. So certainly when the evidence standards framework was being generated, this was a question that was very much raised. And I think the philosophy was at the time that if there was clinical data that could be transferred out of doing clinical trials, for example, in one geography with a cohort of patients from which the data could easily translate to another geography, then that data could be evaluated. Where data could not be transferred was where it very much related to a particular patient pathway that was very individual to that particular geography. And in some respects, even within the UK, some of that data may need to be sort of repurposed in slightly different way, because pathways even in the UK are not all standard for all patients. And particularly if you're looking at using technology within a social care setting versus a secondary care setting, for example. You know, I personally don't have experience of data being directly transferable from different continents and countries. However, the philosophy is certainly there that it could.
I don't think we've reached the point we need to get to with our ability to transfer evidence, Henry, not only across regulatory regions, but I just saw someone put a note in the chat that, you know, evidence can barely be sort of transferred across, you know, different wards within the NHS. And I think what that comes down to, my take, and I'm curious to hear what folks in the audience think, I mean, that should be our goal: harmonization across regulatory regions, across different use cases across different health systems, across different countries should be the goal. Why? Because it's unethical to patients to keep repeating the same tests because we can't get ourselves organized enough to redeploy and reuse the evidence. And it's unethical to keep patients waiting while we repeat the same tests over and over. I also think it will, just as Sven said earlier, continue to stifle innovation. But I think we can't get there until we have a shared vision of what good looks like. And I think that, you know, different regulatory regions, different decision makers within different sort of purchasing authorities might have, you know, their own priorities in how they rank order different sort of elements of a framework around what good looks like for their culture, for their sort of, for their priorities, for their patient population, so on and so forth. But until we have a shared vision of what those elements and what that framework is, we're going to be talking past each other. And so Henry, I'm delighted you asked the question. I think that has to be the goal, but I don't think we're going to get there until we do the foundational work of coming together and agreeing upon what high quality looks like and how we define and how we measure it.
I love that question. I'm still debating it frequently, and I agree with both you, Neelam and Jen. Maybe to add a different perspective on it. So the German government now very clearly says we only accept data from Germany. And they argue that that's also because the entire cultural and care background and so on is influencing that way too much to just take something from, I don't know, the US or even the UK. I think that sounds reasonable, but even within Germany, if I think about the time when we had all of those Syrian refugees, so these people have very different backgrounds, a different language, different culture, different genetic setup, etc., etc. How much would we still accept evidence from a purely, let's say, previously German population to then one that is marked by potentially millions of immigrants? And we also have a big sort of Turkish community and so on. So if we go down that road, probably we should be even more focused on other social determinants of health or cultural factors and so on, that we might have to correct for, if that makes sense in some cases. But I think then at some point you get to a point where the pendulum is too far on one side and it just becomes not feasible anymore to get evidence for every sort of influencing variable. But another conversation that I also find quite interesting, and that kind of builds on this overfitting debate that we're just having in the chat. I think that, and I've seen that, you can have something that really fits super well to one hospital or one ward, and then you run into problems once you want to adapt it somewhere else, which is, by the way, a big issue with most of the machine learning technologies that I've seen so far, and why you still have to have a human in the loop and so on. There's a nice piece by A16Z, which is in Andreessen Horowitz, a California-based venture capital fund, and they analyzed what is the return on investment, or sort of the economic outcome of machine learning versus traditional software. And in traditional software, you have a 70% margin. In machine learning, you're more at 30%, which is close to service business. And part of the reason is exactly sort of the things that just have been mentioned. And another thing, I think, where this might be more helpful is to think about what is the, what do we mean when we talk about data? We also know that data has very different half-lives. If I have a tool that is supposed to predict something physiological in my body, it's probably not going to change over the next 100 years unless something significant happens. But if I look at maybe the incidence of stroke now with COVID, might become a different story in the next couple of years. So I can't use the same epidemiological data that I've had before. And it's sometimes super difficult to understand where the half-life of my data is really short and where it's longer, or where something is applicable from another country and where not. And that very much depends on the other independent variables that affect the outcome I'm trying to measure. So I think a generic answer is super complicated to give, and it really depends on the solution and the outcome.
So a couple of people in the chat, Ian Wallace, some other people have, and indeed some of our panel have already raised this issue of reimbursement and different reimbursement models in different countries. Do you think it's regulatory differences that matter more, or is it actually these different reimbursement models that make it harder for digital health companies to go from one country to another with their product?
I'll take a stab at that. I think that the payer environment here in the US and just the sheer enormity of the market, a lot of innovators who are US based are still establishing their foothold here in the States before they think about leaving the US market and taking their products and their initiatives and their offerings to other markets. So I don't have, Henry, at my fingertips, sort of a case example of where a particular product or a particular modality of care, and I'll circle back to that in a second, has been sort of successful here, found a foothold, and then struggled elsewhere. I think the very nature of sort of the US regulatory and sort of reimbursement approach has, particularly in the last year or so, actually sort of precipitated some really innovative approaches. So we're starting to see, and I'm curious to hear from my colleagues whether you're seeing this in Europe, these sort of virtual first medical organizations appearing that harness community, that there's no brick and mortar sites, but they treat a particular condition. Quite often they're in a narrow vertical, and they really sort of wrap their arms around the patient with a particular sort of need or condition, and they'll use a suite of communications technologies through a smartphone to connect them with health coaches or clinicians. They're able to sort of prescribe through their app, perhaps a digital therapeutic if needed, or ship medication. And then they have a suite of measurement tools embedded in the platform that allow them to sort of monitor health remotely. That's a really interesting case example, because during the course of COVID, a lot of our reimbursement has been, we've been appropriately recognizing virtual visits. And there's a lot of conversation over here in the US right now about, you know, whether we extend the reimbursement models created during the crisis to, sadly, I don't feel the crisis is going away anytime soon, especially here in the US, but, you know, do we make this a more permanent change? At the same time, there's also the physician fee schedule that's on deck here in the US through CMS, which is the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. They evaluate that every October, and for 2021, there are now codes for reimbursement for remote monitoring, sort of order of magnitude higher than we've ever seen before. So to actually circle back and try and answer your question, I haven't seen anyone who's sort of really had success in the US struggle abroad, but I think that may be because we haven't seen that those business initiatives to take products to scale. Although Neelam and Sven, definitely correct me if you know of examples that I may have missed.
I've seen some UK companies look to the US market as being an easier one to sell to in terms of HMOs in some situations, rather than an NHS where it seems less clear who buys the product, and is there a big buyer in the same way there is of an HMO, because often the purchasing in the UK is quite devolved. But Neelam, Sven, do you have any other examples?
I think from our experience, there are a lot of technology developers in the UK that do go to the US for a bigger market and also an attractiveness in terms of investment. But I don't think that is specific to digital per se. But equally, we've seen the same from a US point of view, well, perhaps not necessarily to the same extent, but there is movement from the US to the UK. And I can't think of, I mean, there are some examples in the chat, and I agree with those. I can't think of additional ones at the moment. I would say that I mean, going back to what you were saying around payer models and regulatory sort of constraints, certainly there is a lot more opportunity, I think, with having creative payer models that does encourage scale up and adoption much more so than having, you know, consistent regulation, in my view. And I think that this is definitely something that NICE, who is the HTA organisation in the UK, is looking to, along with the Accelerated Access Collaborative, and I know I'm talking about lots of sort of organisations here. What would I say? And I think certainly NICE are looking at piloting they are piloting evaluation of digital technologies and providing guidance to commissioning bodies in the NHS across the board, and that will be coming up, which will certainly help in incentivising the right evidence approaches and also supporting commissioners to adopt and scale up technologies, you know, nationally, which is following a not dissimilar model to pharmaceutical payment and reimbursement. So, you know, I think that that's certainly the tack that I potentially see happening, although, again, as we've talked about, having clarity in terms of standards and understanding of how these standards can then translate to commissioning really needs to be accelerated from an innovator point of view, but also from a commissioning point of view.
We better go back to Jean for some final comments now.
Well, only final comments. So thank you for everyone who's engaged in the chat, everyone who's joined today, but most of all to our three panelists and experts for their insights. Certainly, this has raised so many issues, from payer models to incentives for evidence generation to how do you conduct your evidence and evaluations and your methods. We would really like to hear your suggestions about what kind of webinars to offer. We are keen to do these discussions for about an hour up until the end of the year. We have some funding available to do that, so we want to make these free and spread the word. We've got full details of the other sessions, including future ones on mental health and a future session on no magic bullet in terms of evidence generation. But last but not least, thank you to the team behind this today, for you for joining, and to Neelam, Jen and Sven for joining. Thanks, everybody.